Thank you, and thank you, Dave, for that very interesting introductory conversation. So now we brought up a couple more people, and one of them, this is going to be Name the Bot. One of them is actually not a real person. So here's what I'll do, is I'll put my hand over each one, and we applaud, and the one with, no, we won't do that. So I'm actually going to let everyone introduce themselves, and this, Dave, is your chance to finally introduce yourself. I apologize that I never got any notes on that. Okay. So why don't we start with Michael, if you can introduce yourself, then Seth, then Dave, and then I have some questions that I can start out with, but mostly this is about us having a conversation.
Hello, good evening. I'm Michael Cushman. What's relevant to my background for tonight is I did work in AI for a while, wrote Prolog and Lisp programming in that age. I also do a lot of work with the brain now, and I've also worked on the future of education and learning and how that works in the brain. So that's somewhat relevant to the topic tonight, so that's why I'm here.
I'm Seth Hurd. I worked with Dave peripherally. I work at University of Colorado in cognitive psychology technically, but we're making neural network models of human cognition, and that started to connect to artificial intelligence concerns. So that's probably my primary qualification. My other thing is that I've always enjoyed science fiction and recently have made that an excuse to read up on all of the artificial intelligence related science fiction out there. So that makes me the token crackpot on the panel.
As I mentioned, I co-founded eCortex, which Seth is also involved in with Randy O'Reilly at the university. Actually, my current gig is I'm running a company called Standing Cloud, which Rich and I have worked together a little bit on the meetup for the cloud, and so that's the latest thing. And I've been a serial entrepreneur, started a number of companies, and I have been in the software industry for 25 years or so. So my connection to this topic is an interest, as well as my connection to obviously the brain models and the idea that we actually are working to create artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, as it's called.
So I want to start out with a question. I would like to have you differentiate between intelligence and self-awareness, because it seems like those were sort of mixed together there, but I think that they're very different concepts, and I can imagine something being extremely intelligent but not self-aware, and that to me is a little less alarming than something that is also self-aware. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
This debate goes on all the time about what the significance of self-awareness and its relationship to technology, and I would say that the way things are leaning these days is that self-awareness is a phenomenon that is more of a coincidence. So the fact that we have language enables us to have self-awareness. It's that modeling in the brain, the abstraction piece that enables that self-awareness, but it's not something fabulous, amazing, incredible, enlightening, spiritual thing. It's a coincidence that because we translate everything into symbolic processing and language, it creates a certain sense of seeing ourselves outside of ourselves. Because we abstract everything, including ourselves. It's just a byproduct of how we're already processing things.
So then if I can clarify, you're saying that we aren't actually self-aware, per se.
No, we are totally self-aware, but it's not such a big deal.
Seth, what do you think?
I think if you're concerned with how to really come to grips with how the human brain works and how to build an artificial system that's aware, this is a question that you're going to really want to come to grips with. But for the larger topic of the singularity, I think it's actually completely irrelevant. Whether or not something is self-aware is beside the point of the effect it has on you and your life, and I think that's probably what we're trying to come to grips with when we're talking about the singularity as such.
So this question is addressed in philosophy as well as in science, and Michael's point is that consciousness is, or self-awareness at least, is epiphenomenal, is what it's called, and meaning that it's a byproduct of something else more important. I don't actually think there are any epiphenomena. I don't think that's the case. I think all these things happen and they all tie together. However, if you are actually going to build it, I do agree with Michael that the awareness of anything and being able to be aware means that you can be self-aware as long as you also have language. So this is a complicated thing. So bugs are aware, sort of in a sense, of their surroundings, but they're not really aware of themselves. There's a significant question as to whether higher animals are aware of themselves, but we are, because we have languages and can create concepts. So at the level of functionality, I think I agree with Michael. At the other level, though, I think that you can't really have intelligence without self-awareness. They are tied together in a deep way, probably through a common cause. In other words, the thing that creates one creates the other necessarily, and so it's not just a coincidence, it's actually necessary.
Okay, next question, and then I'll open it up, is we see so much dark imagery in science fiction and in the media about the future, about singularity, about smart machines, anyone, Skynet, all that sort of stuff. Why is that? Why is the future not so rosy? So what's your thought on that? Maybe you can start, Dave.
I think it makes for more interesting stories. I think that's a lot of it. I also think that people who write often are darker people, and so they see the people who are bright and rosy go into sales. I mean, right? They don't write science fiction, and so you're laughing because I'm right? And so, it's just kind of a natural consequence of how that happens. I don't think that necessarily is any kind of a vote or expert, crowdsourcing on what's going to happen. I don't think that's really a reflection of it. I think it makes for better and more interesting stories when there's drama and problems.
Okay, as our resident crackpot, Seth, what's your take on this?
Well, I agree with Dave that it's because it makes more interesting stories, but beyond that, I kind of take the opposite view. Those are incredibly rosy stories because the real story is that everyone's gone, and therefore there's nothing of interest there for any human. And this is this sounds like a crazy thing to say, but I think when you crunch through what would happen with something much smarter than us and without our particular limitations, that we are stuck in our little meat brain, we're sitting on the resources that a machine would want to use to do whatever its thing is. If you build a machine to calculate pi, it's going to want to do that as best it can. To do that, it's going to need all of the available nearby resources, and the most available nearby resources are all the carbon that's sitting on Earth. It doesn't care about us, but it sort of needs to do its job or to fulfill its desires as best possible. And whatever those desires are, it needs the stuff that we're sitting on. So I think if there is a tiny, tiny space of possibilities in which humans continue to exist alongside a truly superior being, and that's the case in which that being cares about the humans continuing to exist. At the very least, regards us as puppies, something cute to facilitate their little lives. So I actually think that the purpose of science fiction is to prognosticate things that could happen in the future. 1984 hasn't come to pass, but that could be because the book 1984 was written, and everyone has become paranoid about that. So I hope that's the process that we're engaged in here, that we become paranoid enough about the possible bad outcomes from the future that we avoid those.
So then you're not a fan of baking in the 3 laws of robotics?
That's one possible way to avoid the bad outcomes. It's very, very difficult to get there with rules. I'm an advocate of Yudkowsky's idea of truly friendly AI, that at the very core of this thing's goal structure is to make people happy, that it really loves us. And I think that's the best route past it. But even that is far from easy. Whatever goal you try to build into your machine, in order for it to improve itself and get smarter, it's going to need to be able to interpret its goals in terms of the new knowledge that it's taking on board. And so there's going to be a matter of it reinterpreting what you've told it to do and what you've told it to love. And so it's a highly non-trivial...
Like your kids do.
Right. Right, for all of you that have tried raising children. Non-trivial in that sense, and then some more besides.
Well, I agree the darkness just becomes a great storyline. And by the way, the humans always win at the end, right? They do. Yes, they do. Every movie that humans win, eventually the cyborg gets burnt or crushed or something happens. So in reality, they're all stories about human resilience against a machine gone wild or the Matrix, right? It's always the human wins in the end. So that's the story we want to tell. And actually, my point of view about this is that the human will never allow the machine to ever be that intelligent. So we will incorporate machines, we will use machines as tools, we will never just create a general purpose learning tool, give it all the sensory input it wants, let it connect to everything else it wants, and do whatever it wants. And it has all the power to create matter and do whatever it wants. I don't think human ego will ever allow us to do that. So I have kind of a fundamental problem with this, in that those stories, the human wins, we want to win, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, if we have, as human beings, we need something pushing against us. Otherwise, we have no motivation to get up in the morning to do anything. If our day is so easy that we don't have to do anything, we can just sit, lounge around all day, and everything is perfect and wonderful. There's no economy in that. There's no way that we can actually make money off of that. There's no motivation for us to continue forward. And so if everything gets solved in the world, then I think we start regressing. I think we go backwards.
So what you're asking about is you're assuming the singularity and superior beings have made life that you're assuming the utopian view that we will be their pets approximately, and then the question is, what is the human condition once we are pets instead of those that have to create? Is that
right,
basically what you're asking?
Yeah.
Well, probably that falls under the realm of we don't know, because it's the singularity, right? It's going to change things so dramatically that that we don't know what that looks like. I will say that there are potentially, though, people who are models for that today, who essentially have, these are people who have small incomes, like artists and people who are in theater and all of the arts and music. These are all very low-paid jobs overall, unless you're one of the 3 people in the world who excels at it so highly that people pay a lot of money for it. So what if we were all freed to be creative? And use our creative instincts instead of needing to, let us just say, bus tables or write software or whatever the other, write software in the model of Initech, if you've seen Office Space. So doing these things that are not really tapping our creative juices, but rather just making us, we need to earn a living, right? If we didn't need to do that, would we be creative? Bertrand Russell actually talks about this in Search of what's it called? In Praise of Idleness, and he talks about people having more time to be creative and such. And I'm not sure I agree with that at his level, because I think that not everybody would do that, right? But that's okay. I mean, how many people just sit and watch TV most of the day these days? That's very common also. So I think you have models for it today. And it would just be extended, is possibly an answer.
So I think you're talking about a very real problem, the way that we have more depression, possibly, you could argue this, but I tend to think it's true, more depression in the first world than in third world countries, that people really need struggle. But I think this is relatively, to put it this way, this is planning the victory party before you have a game plan. This is the least of the worries about this whole affair. The world where we get to wonder about what we all do once we all have free time and our flying saucers and banquets every meal is not what we should be worrying about at this point. And there are a number of different answers. You tweak, once you understand the brain that well, and you don't even need to worry about it because you're going to have a machine that understands your brain vastly better, you tweak the part of the brain that needs constant conflict. Just redo it if you don't like it. Another one is to create vast, elaborate, competitive scenarios that you can engage in at your leisure if you want to, if you need that kind of conflict. But so there are a number of different answers to this, but I think that this is really asking the wrong question. This is planning the victory party before you've planned the campaign.
What if self-replicating life that we're creating, we're in the process of creating right now, comes about, and the carbon life killer, the big asteroid hits and wipes out everything we know as life right now. But these other entities survive and continue to evolve, and after several die-offs, a few of them come up with theories of origins, and they say, oh, well, the legends say that there was a creator that created us. And others say, no, we evolved. There's some lightning hit the beach, and there's some silicone and some aluminum and some gallium and some arsenic, and the first diodes formed, and we can see them getting more complex as time goes on.
So I actually started working on a short story that's basically that. I'm now going to stop because other people have thought of it, but there are theories that DNA or whatever, the sources came from somewhere else, right? That it came from meteorites or whatever, and that this is a common chemical that is all over the place in the universe, and it just kind of it survives certain types of events. So it's not really a it's not even quite science fiction-y. It's more kind of another stage past, right, where you don't know where it all came from. And it could be, the Earth consists of elements that are from several cycles of suns exploding and reforming. And so who knows where it all came from? That's a different question. We're kind of barely prepared to talk about where it's going. So.
I pass. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure there was a question in there, actually, but certainly could happen, right? I guess. But what's the point? I guess. Yeah, it's cool.
I have a more simple question. If we're going to be pets in the future, assuming that that's kind of the analogy you have made, do we have any way right now to measure our intelligence versus animal intelligence, if animals actually have intelligence? And to that point, I guess I'm thinking, do I know that my dogs are truly happy being a pet? So I guess the point is we're getting beyond intelligence to how does that have to do with happiness?
All right, I'm going to start with the animal intelligence versus human intelligence. So I'm going to disagree with Dave. I say anything that learns is intelligent. So a bumblebee is intelligent. A hummingbird knows where all the flowers are, what type of flowers, when does the nectar come back to that flower, because it needs to be very efficient because it uses a lot of energy in order to feed itself. That's intelligence to me. So just in general, are animals intelligent? I say yes. Okay, anything that can learn is intelligent. That's my simple definition. There are complications after that because you can't separate intelligence out from the sensory input into the intelligence. So if you took a human and you stuck him in an eagle, the human brain inside an eagle, a lot of the processing that you have is related to what the eagle can do. It's like the eagle's got great eyesight but lousy hearing or whatever, so our hearing parts would fade away to some extent. So it's just the connection into the brain makes part of the intelligence. How much input, how quality of the input, does it see color, is it black and white, what resolution does it have? So intelligence gets murky just when you start talking about input. So you can't separate out the processor, which we haven't really had that conversation, from the inputs into the processor. And what is it inputting? What different forms of waves of light or whatever. It could be all kinds of things could be inputted, which affect. Now, the pet thing, I'm not going to answer that. I'll leave that for these guys.
How happy is your dog? My dog seems pretty happy. I don't know. I'm not sure I have a good answer to the question. It's sort of one of methodology. With people, it works surprisingly well to ask them how happy they are. They're not right. You can find that they're distorting those things in systematic ways, but in large part, it's a decent guess, and that's as good as you're going to get. In the long term, the answer is you need to let that dog try what he's doing and then try something else and then see what she chooses. That's sort of the definition of Happiness might be a little different. That would be a way to clearly define his preference, which I think is a sort of clearer, more empirical way to think about ethics, giving people and animals what they want over making them happy. Because if you talk about happiness, then we wind up with an IV in our arm with some heroin in it, as well as the nutrients we need to stay alive, and we're ecstatically happy in one sense, but that might not be something that we would choose. So it's a very complex philosophical and scientific issue mixed together, which I find fascinating, but again, slightly off topic. I may be a little too single-minded here, but I find a lot of this stuff to be of peripheral but not central interest to worrying about getting this right, an event that may or may not be rapidly approaching in our history.
I think the analogy to pets does break down in the sense that, and leaning on something that Michael said, is that intelligence is. I actually don't think we really disagree. Intelligence is something that's in degrees, and I don't know if it's as simple as just learning, but learning is clearly a huge component of it. The Watson thing learned, but I don't really consider it intelligent for different reasons. But there's a big discontinuity at what I'd call conceptual intelligence, or what allows us to use language in a very powerful way, and that's what humans have over and above animals. Even animals that have learned any number of words, they can teach chimps. Now they're teaching them like 1,000 words at a time, but they can't really use it in context in the same way that we can. It's not really the same thing. And so the fact that animals, like your dog, can't actually talk to you about whether it's happy matters in terms of this, right? Because if we are the pets of the robots, right, in that scenario, they can actually ask us. Now, they may have capabilities that go beyond conceptual intelligence that we don't even know what that is, but they would certainly be able to, just as we can speak in a high-pitched voice to our dog to make it respond in a particular way, thereby speaking their whatever part of their language. A superior being like that would be able to speak with us in our terms and be able to ask us whether we're happy. Now, of course, there's a lot of debate about whether we have even the first clue about whether we're really happy. And anybody who's been in therapy knows that that's a harder question than it seems like. But I think this discontinuity at conceptual intelligence, the ability to truly use language, is probably the difference in where the analogy with pets breaks down.
A more specific question here: what is this current state of memristor technology? How hard is it to mass produce, and how reliable are the memristors we can make currently?
I don't know too much about the current state of the art. The point at which I knew a little more about it was maybe 3 years ago when we were proposing on that project, and it was pretty interesting. It was pretty far along from a process perspective, meaning they could synthesize the wafers that produced memories and memristor circuits. They were relatively reliable and stable. They were synthesizing though a few at a time, and so they weren't able to characterize whether they would last, whether they would melt easily, any of those kinds of things. So at a point 3 years ago, they were again lab entities, not anything that they were mass producing. The amount of publication that has come out of the Synapse program has not been large so far, so it's hard to know how reliable IBM's are. Obviously, IBM is good at this stuff, and so presumably they're also working on the side on some of those types of issues. But I think they're worrying right now about the conceptual issues behind it, whether they can actually get the circuits to learn, and whether they can get them to interact, and whether they can design circuits that work together. More than actually worrying about the kind of longer term stuff like that. That'll come when they start getting to 65,000. Neurons on the circuit, and some of those things really start to matter more.
A recent innovation I read probably about 6 weeks ago, it's actually using phase material instead of using the chips. So by using phase material is you add a charge to it and it changes the molecular structure. the properties of the material. And this enables both memory and processing in the same element. It's significantly cheaper than these chips. So we'll see where that goes. But I read that and I was really impressed. I think that's significantly better than what we've been doing for the last 20 years, trying to build chips, neuron chips. So we'll see.
In the timeline to 2045, there's going to be significant milestones that you are going to have to meet prior to 2045. Otherwise, you won't be able to get there. What is the next milestone, and what are some subsequent milestones that once we get there, then we're on the path to singularity?
If I really think about it, I think the stuff I talked about with Synapse, the Synapse program at DARPA, and it was pointed out to me that not everybody knows what DARPA is. It's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and they funded the internet. Basically, that's the indirect way that Al Gore claims that he invented the internet. But Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The original name for the internet was ARPANET. So, they've funded a lot of other projects, including the Grand Challenge, et cetera. In any case, when you really think about it, that is one of the big impediments to progress right now, is that when we simulate the brain's functions in detail, it's a computational limitation. It's just very difficult to simulate, not the processing. It turns out, this is very interesting, it's not the processing that is hard to simulate, but the communication among all the neurons that is hard to simulate in a computer, because no matter how you break it down with that von Neumann architecture I talked about, there is a bottleneck of communication. If you do it on separate computers using a network, you have, and it's very interesting, it's not a bandwidth limitation, it's not how thick the fiber is, and not how much data you can pass back and forth, but how long it takes to send the first signal from one neuron to another. And so we're very limited in terms of our simulation complexity. I think Seth, how big is the vision model right now? It's got like 20,000 units or something like that?
I don't even know. It's definitely on that scale.
It's on that scale. So 20,000 units, and we sort of, because of the way it's done, we usually figure that maybe somewhere between 50 and 100 real neurons that it's simulating. So, on the order of a couple 100,000 real neurons in your brain, which is, the visual system is 30 billion neurons, I believe. And so there's just not the scale. And so the Synapse program is actually a really good next step to being able to do that, because it will allow us to get that kind of scale that we need to really simulate the larger networks. That's my view.
I have a slightly different perspective. Despite working on the same technology that Dave's talking about, the neural networks that are pursuing a very straightforward adaptation of how the human brain works into artificial intelligence, I'm not at all sure that's where our answers will come from. So I'd put the milestones as behavioral and cognitive ones rather than technical ones. Dave could very well be right that we need those advances in the hardware before we see cognitive advances, but I'm much less convinced of that myself. When we worked on the BICA program that Dave mentioned, biologically inspired cognitive architectures, as Dave said, that's where we got hung up, is defining what progress would really be. How would we know that we're getting anywhere closer to a general intelligence? And the best answer that we came up with was that you would want to see it do the same cognitive feats that we see from something like a 1-year-old to a 2-year-old child as a first thing. And if you think about the cognitive feats that a 1-year-old is doing, they seem unimpressive, and yet they're things that machines can't replicate, particularly learning to do instead of being programmed to do those things. So I tend to think that we will know it when we see it, but we'll be fooled a few times. So it's easy to have behavior look intelligent and not be intelligent. The Furby that they made a few years ago, it's like, wow, look at that little guy, he loves me. He didn't love you, he didn't love us. He was programmed in a very, very simple way. But once we both see how something is behaving and ask a few simple questions about how it's accomplishing this, to what extent it's learning from the ground up how to do what it's doing, we'll have a clear sense that we're getting somewhere, and it will look something like the progression that we have each gone through to achieve our general intelligence.
I'm with Dave as far as I think it's really fundamentally figuring out the equivalent of the brain is really the biggest breakthrough. If we can get the communication for a significant number of neurons and understand essentially how memory and processing is done in a little more detail than we're at right now with the brain. I think that's a major breakthrough, and I do think, I mentioned before, this phase material, I think that's a significant breakthrough. Well, I'll see how it plays out, but I think that could be something. So I think it may be nanotechnology that enables us, so we may actually have, who knows, the actual progression of this, but it may be significant achievements in nanotechnology enable us to figure out how to simulate a neuron, a significant, with the communications built in. So, we don't know how we get there, but I kind of think it's a structural issue myself before we can, because it's really, we don't have another model. The brain is just genius, and we don't understand how it works, and it's the best model we got. And until we can figure that one out, before we can do the next and the next and the next.
Some of this makes me just think, the pure question is, and I see differences in the way you guys answer, is this a hardware issue or a software issue? And, we were supposed to be on Mars right now, but there are some physical limitations with going to Mars. I wonder how much of this is what we're faced with, and maybe are those dates a little too jumping the gun that people throw out for these singularities based on needing these physical changes.
By the way, I don't disagree with Seth at all that the cognitive components are critical. The original question was one of what's the next step? And the fact of the matter is that all these things are currently progressing in parallel anyway. So, the next milestone won't look like one piece of progress. It'll look like several all at the same time, and they'll come together and be integrated, et cetera. But in Kurzweil's earlier books, it's interesting, in his earlier books, he thought that hardware was what it was all about. He didn't talk at all about reverse engineering the brain. He talked all about Moore's law and his extension of that. He talked about quantum computers, which I think he's completely stopped talking about now. There are all these different things that we were going to progress computational speed with, and that was going to solve the problem. And the hardware is important because if you don't get beyond a certain level of power, then you can't do it. But in the end, and I was explaining to someone before the discussion, IBM's Blue Brain project, which is essentially a simulation of millions of neurons and their entire neurochemistry and all we know about that neurochemistry, and they're trying to create intelligence from that. I think it has as many neurons as a rat brain or something like that, and maybe not that many. Anyway, it's just neuron soup, and it's not going to create anything interesting. There's more to it than that. The cognitive issues, the brain's structural components, the way pieces of it interact, the way inhibition occurs throughout the brain, but in very discrete ways. I mean, there are all these things that need to be replicated beyond just kind of how neurons work together and connecting them together. So the hardware and the software, kind of in a very that's not really a very good distinction in the brain, but both the hardware and the software pieces of it are, I think, critically important to making progress.
Let me just add one brief thought to that. I fully agree that it's a hardware and a software issue, but people like to make a lot of the fact that we don't know how hard it is to build an artificial mind, but I would like to suggest that we also actually don't know how easy it might be to make that mind. So we know that if we reproduce the human brain precisely, we would get something as smart as we are, but we don't know what shortcuts it might be possible to take. So it could be that hardware is more of a limitation. It could be that software is more of a limitation. I'm not sure anyone is in a position to say right now.
So on the road to singularity, is there any, actually let me take a step back and say, I would argue that humans in a lot of ways don't act intelligently, right? We're like emotional creatures. We may not do what's the most intelligent thing, but just because we're pissed off at somebody or we've got an ego or we got something going on, we take a different route. To the path. So on the road to singularity, are the authors, or do you guys yourselves think there are certain things that we've got to figure out about ourselves first before we can, program into a machine and then have it make the same mistakes? That's one question. And then the second question would be, if a machine is given those imperfect, if we get the capacity before we figure ourselves out, before we really understand what intelligence is, do you think that a machine would have the abilities to correct those things in us that are imperfect and don't make a lot of sense sometimes?
I love this question. All right. I think one of the greatest, looking at it from the point of view, what's cool about this, what would be great, is actually to understand ourselves. So if we have a mind-machine interface that can tell us what our unconscious mind is doing and why it's doing it, because right now we don't have a lot of circuitry between between cognition, symbolic processing, and what our unconscious limbic system did. So our limbic system might react to the tone of voice that was the same as our father's that really got us, tweaked us, right? We don't even know that's why we don't like that person. We just know we don't like that person, and we make up some cognitive reason why we don't like that person. So if we could actually get machines to interface with our unconscious mind to tell our conscious mind what's going on, because we're missing the circuitry right now, we actually could have tremendous self-awareness from this process. And so it could be a benefit to getting what you want. Not that we don't have to evolve first in order before, we can really use this technology. That's my perspective.
Just to address the first half of the question, and probably only imperfectly, no, I don't think that we need to be any smarter than we are. That it could be very much to our detriment that we don't need to be smarter than we are to get something smarter yet than us going. I'm very concerned that we will succeed too quickly and in a poorly considered way, very much to our detriment. Should we be lucky enough to succeed, to really succeed, then absolutely the machines could tell us things about ourselves that we would really like to know.
So first, I think you're conflating rationality and intelligence, and there's an important lesson there, because I think that's one of the things that the early AI researchers did, which is that they thought that if they just could reproduce language function and combinations of words, that it would all be over. And what they forgot is that most of our brain is doing other stuff like seeing and perceiving objects and hearing things and smelling stuff, and then all the stuff that we don't even know what it is doing that Michael was talking about. So that's an important distinction also. The challenge there is that I don't know how easy it is to tease apart the things that are good versus the things that we consider at some level bad, right? So we get angry, but maybe we need to get angry, and then maybe anger is part of creativity. And it's not easily teased apart. The other thing is that I think if we wait until we've figured it out for ourselves, I don't think it's ever going to happen, because we've had a lot of time to do that and seemingly made only a little bit of progress. And so I actually like Michael's answer, which is that maybe we can learn something about ourselves. And by the way, there are plenty of technologies that are out there now that are showing signs of being able to illustrate these things for us. I mean, fMRI and which is they measure blood flow in your brain to see what kinds of things are being processed when you're thinking about certain things or when you're experiencing something. Or similarly, ERP, which is more the electrode thing, and patterns that happen consistently. And so we're starting to be able to see some of these things from the outside, and with nanoelectronics and such, maybe we can see some of them from the inside at some point. So I like that answer, and I think some of that could even come before the singularity, before we've done anything with that. But
so far, a lot of the discussion about singularity seems to be about modeling the human brain. You agree? So my question is, in addition to that, what else do we need to achieve to be able to achieve a singularity?
Well, my claim in the talk was that is what you need. Not everyone would agree with that, and Kurzweil probably wouldn't quite agree with it, although I think he would say there's something to that. The reason I think that is what you need, and when you say model the human brain, again, you need to be modeling it. You need to have really reverse engineered it, right? It doesn't count that you can just pick out that's a leopard in the tree. You actually have to know that that's a problem. And you have to be able to figure out maybe something that you can do about it, if there's anything to be done about it, or maybe you can. Modeling in its full capabilities, I think that's what causes the singularity. Because, and I didn't get into this in the talk, but once you have that, you have something that now you can replicate and have it learn from that base without having to go through this whole 18-year education process that we have, right? You can, preserve it. It can be copied so that it can start over when it experiments with things and falls off the cliff, it can start over. It's kind of Groundhog Day, right? But it keeps learning. And you can keep throwing better hardware at it. You can connect it to different machines. Its perceptual inputs can include not just a pair of eyes in front of a box, but it could actually include all of the video cameras in the world, right? So all of a sudden, it has capabilities that far outstrip what the human has. So the singularity occurs when you have human-level intelligence in a simulation that now you can do all these things with, and it very quickly becomes far beyond what humans can do. So I think that's sufficient, and then presumably it'll figure out ways to put implants in our heads and stuff like that. So.
I think that's exactly right, and so I have nothing to add, and so just to restate and perhaps clarify that, as soon as you have something as smart as a human that has, let's call them additional abilities, not a lack of our weaknesses, that you can copy and that you can run faster than real time, then you effectively have something that's smarter than a human. The third one is that its hardware isn't fragile in the way that ours is. You can just poke a few extra neurons in there, and if you put them in the right spot, then now it's 2 neurons smarter than we are. So you've already broken that barrier. So I think that's exactly right.
I heard 2 definitions of singularity. One was the rate in which change just happens so fast. Basically, the innovation continues so that it becomes a system unto itself. Is that fair, Dave? Was some reference to that? Change happens so fast, so rapidly. Did you just...
I think that there's a distinction between what causes it and what it is.
Okay.
So what you just described, I think, is what it is, which is that technological progress happens so fast that we can't even kind of conceive of it. Mm-hmm. What causes it is what I just said, in my view.
All right, so it could be the case, Dave, to answer your question, that we could get to the point where we have rapid change in so many different fields. Say nanotechnology just takes off, right? We are able to change our physical self every single day, because we can change ourselves at a molecular level, right? And we've created the equivalent of DNA in an artificial way that enables that to happen. Simply take a pill or whatever, and it triggers a completely different physical form. And we could change any matter into any other matter. That could create a world that would be changing at a rapidly pace that we could not probably handle, understand, and process, and have nothing to do with artificial intelligence in the brain. But it could be the case that you need the artificial intelligence to unlock the key to nanotechnology. I don't know. But I think there's more ways to get to that sort of crazy state where we're not in control. Human beings are not in control of what's going on anymore.
I think, first of all, Seth can elaborate more on this, but I think a right brain, left brain is a fairly artificial distinction, and it isn't, I don't know that there's actually evidence that there are that's the right conceptual difference. However, I know what you're talking about, and it's interesting to point out that I would perceive Randy O'Reilly, who's the professor that Seth and I both work with, he's pretty right-brained when it comes down to it. And the interesting and notable point there might be that whenever we get into discussions in the lab about the outcomes, Randy's just, I'm pretty optimistic. He's just extraordinarily optimistic about this. He is not worried at all about the dystopian scenarios. He doesn't think it's a concern. He's very excited about where it might lead and about the possibilities, and just enjoys working on it and making it's a creative impulse, which I think is generally classified as a right brain thing. He is, of course, also male, but and interestingly enough, his wife, who's also a cognitive psychology professor, is very left-brained. So just to push on those distinctions a little bit, but I think that's an interesting example of someone who views it a little bit differently than this kind of logical crew that you happen to have up here. So I don't, Randy actually paints and does art too. His paintings are kind of creepy, but.
You have to be pretty darn left-brained to be in the field at all, and then if you have good right-brained abilities as well, that's a bonus. So no, let's see. I'm not sure if you'd call it in the field, but I'm sure that there are some science fiction authors that have thought through the possibilities in a more right-brained way. I'm really not sure what you're looking for here from a right brain analysis. like to sort of think that I keep some balance of creative and analytical thinking, and so to try to channel someone who is more right-brained, the way that I might put it is that I've tried to keep things very cool and logical here, but on the larger scale, the message is that a very big change is coming. It could very well happen. It's not certain, but it's very possible. It's something that we should be both extremely afraid of and very, very excited about. It's the possibility of everything that we love and hold dear as humans coming to an abrupt end and ending forever. But the inverse possibility is that everything that we love and hold dear could be expanded in ways totally beyond our current imagination. In order to not sound crazy, I haven't scratched the surface of what we might do if we truly understood and therefore could alter our own minds. We could become who we want to be beyond the level that we could even conceive of it now, because as you become the person you want to be, that new person gains new, smarter ideas about who they might want to be. So what we're talking about is the balance between the absolute cessation of humanity and the sort of multiplication of the essence of what we love about the better aspects of humanity to a degree that we can't even conceive of now.
I'm not sure I know exactly what you're going for. I'll just tell you I know some distinctions between male and female brains, and that has almost nothing to do with right and left-hand brain. And so men have more gray matter, which is more processing power. Women have more white matter, which is more connectivity in the brain. Is that what you're really referring to, is that women tend to be less compartmentalized in their thought process? Okay. Okay. I think just the nature of the work, regardless of who's actually driving this one, it ends up in the same spot, because the key, as Dave was talking about, is how do we get all these neurons to talk to one another? And it's in the connectivity that comes creativity, and thinking out of the box, and just the way that intelligence will really be will not be on the processing side. We already have the computers that process like crazy, but it has only taken us so far. It's in only one way. To do this thing that we're talking, that's being suggested here as an equivalent of an intelligence greater than ourselves, will be a brain that not only can generate as much gray matter as it wants, but it creates so many connections to so many other things with so much sensory input that it blows away anything that we have in our minds about how the world works or connects or things are related or creativity or anything. It doesn't matter that there's scientists driving it and they're a very left brain. The end result is really more what you're talking about.
How much of this is a understanding of physics, like superconductive processes, and how much of it is, there might be things that are occurring that we don't even have any inkling of. How can we identify what is invisible to us now that might be, that aha thing that triggers the everything coming together, brings a lot of different fields together. For instance, the David Taylor naval research that's done with the squids, the superconductive sensors that they measure the blood flow to the brain and so forth. Their conclusion was that the thought process either has superconductive elements that the squids can't pick up, or that it occurs outside the brain.
I think you're talking about the Penrose theory and similar ones, that the brain is working at a quantum level, or even in stranger ways than that our brain is an antenna for something that's happening outside it. Given what I know about the brain, I find those completely unnecessary and therefore uncomplicated, overly complicated theories about how the brain does what it does. The brain has an unbelievable amount of complexity within it, and really starting to look at and come to grips with how rich the complexity and ordered complexity within the brain is, I think that dispels any need to come up with something more magical to produce something as marvelous as people. The brain's got plenty going on inside it. So it's possible, but I think vanishingly unlikely that we need to understand something more mysterious than the way that neurons work together, because that's pretty magical and mysterious on its own.
All right, with that, actually, I'd like to thank Michael, Seth, and Dave, and thank all of you for joining us. And I think we're going to call it a wrap. Thanks very much.